Hello, I'm Willard Jenkins, and my latest book is called Ain't But a Few of Us, and it's subtitled Black Music Writers Tell Their Story. And the story behind this particular book is that as I was developing my writing, starting as an undergraduate at Kent State University, writing for the Black student newspaper, which was then known as the Black Watch. And as I was developing my writing and becoming more deeply immersed in all things jazz, I began to seek opportunities to travel and cover festivals and other events away from what was then my home market in Cleveland, Ohio. And as I, for example, visited great festivals, like there was a time when George Wein presented his annual festival, not in Newport, but in New York, as a result of some action that happened in Newport that uh, caused him to shift the festival to New York. I started going to that festival, and it was a great festival, and played at various places around New York, starting with Lincoln Center, and uh, a relationship was developed with the loft scene downtown. And so as I began to circulate various events at that festival, at various times I would find myself sitting in a section of journalists who were also covering the festival. And it became interesting to me as I looked around and could see that I was often the only Black writer among those many writers who were covering the festival. And that, of course, raised some questions in my mind. And first and foremost, the fact that jazz music is part of the African experience in America, and jazz initial innovators were all Black musicians. So, with jazz being at its foundation a Black art form, I found it interesting and peculiar after a while that there were so few people that looked like me covering jazz music in the media. And so I began to meet various people, a handful of Black writers who were covering the music. And in 2010, fast forwarding, I started an interview series on my website, which is openskyjazz.com. I have a blog on the website called The Independent Ear. And so I started a series of interviews with Black writers, Black music writers, on the subject of why there, as the book says, ain't but a few of us. And I found a lot of common ground in the interviews and in the things that these writers would often say. And so it became evident after a while that this was perhaps a book project. So the initial interview series online eventually morphed into a book project. And what I did was I continued to interview Black music writers around the country. And as I was interviewing people, others might make me aware of other people in other locales who had been covering jazz from a Black perspective. And so that would lead me to other writers to contribute to these interview series. And so eventually I wound up with a little over 24 Black music writers. And I emphasize Black music writers because most of the writers that I interviewed for this series have written about other music beyond jazz. I'll give you a classic example, and that will be the late Greg Tate. Greg Tate is one of those who was interviewed for this book. There's a Greg Tate chapter in this book. And those of you who know Greg Tate's writings know that he has covered a number of different Black musics. And he has also written about film. And so we have writers who have covered not only music, but also who have covered film and other artistic pursuits in their portfolio of writing. And so we began these interviews, and as I say, common ground was popping up often in these interviews, some commonality of either issues that arose along their pursuit to write about the music, or other elements that they had to deal with along the road. And I want to emphasize, as I always do, that this is not a book of aggrieved writers. These are not writers expressing grievances. This is writers talking about their journey to achieve bylines. These are writers who talk about how they developed their craft and how they eventually achieved bylines and began writing. Some of them began writing books, and others branched out into other opportunities related to the music. But the common ground between all of us is the fact that we've all written about this music we call jazz. And the book is divided into several sections. It opens with my own introduction, talking about my story and how I arrived at this particular subject. And then it follows with a roundtable discussion between several Black music writers. And then the following section is the authors, which includes writers who have written in the long form as authors, written books. People like Platel Benjamin, Herb Boyd, Karen Chilton, Farrah Jasmine Griffin, Robin D.G. Kelly, Tammy Kernodle, Guthrie Ramsey Jr., Gene Seymour, A.B. Spellman, and Greg Tate. And here I have to stop for a moment because I did mention the name A.B. Spellman. Speaking of common influences throughout the journeys of these various writers, the two Black music writers who were most often cited by the contributors to this book as having influenced their writing were Amiri Baraka, who began his writing career as Leroy Jones, and A.B. Spellman. Fortunately, A.B. Spellman is still with us, and A.B. contributed to this book as well. The next section is Black Jazz Magazine Editors and Publishers. And that's an important section because although it's true that none of the major jazz publications have had an African American editor, and I'll repeat that, none of the major jazz publications has ever had an African American editor, with one slight exception. And so this particular section of the book, Black Jazz Magazine Editors and Publishers, is conversations with several Black editors and publishers who have published their own jazz magazines. People like the late Joanne Cheatham, who published Pure Jazz magazine out of Brooklyn. The late Jim Harrison, who published the Jazz Spotlight News out of New York. Hebert Houston, who published Jazz Now out of Northern California, and Ron Welburn, who published a publication called The Grackle back in the 60s. The next section of the book is Black Dispatch Contributors. And that's important because there are only two writers in this particular section, which points to the fact that as far as serious writing about music, our so-called Black Dispatch or Black newspapers have been seriously deficient when it comes to jazz music. I did a lot of research in preparation for this book, and I researched back copies of Black Dispatch publications, Black newspapers in particular. And the jazz coverage that would often appear in those publications was more about jazz as a social phenomenon. In other words, there might be a column that within that column on happenings the following week or that weekend for the publication might be a note about a jazz presentation in the Black neighborhood or in the Black community. But just a note, not any critical sense of writing and not a historic sense of writing. So I was able to find two wonderful writers who currently contribute to Black publications. One of whom is Robin James, who writes for the Minnesota Spokesman and Record in the Twin Cities, and Ron Scott, who writes for the venerable Amsterdam News in New York and writes a jazz column for the Amsterdam News. So those are rare examples of regular jazz columnists and writers who contribute to the so-called Black Dispatch. The following section in the book is devoted to contributions from magazine freelancers. And that includes writers like Bill Brower, Janine Coveney, Lofton and Minari III, Eugene Hawley, John Murph, Don Palmer, and Ron Wynn. The following section is newspaper writers and columnists, and that's three writers contributed to that section. These were writers who were able to develop jazz column bylines, usually on a weekly basis, in major U.S. daily newspapers. And the next section is called The New Breed. And these are writers who have arrived on the scene with their bylines by way of online contributions. And in addition to the history and the thoughts and the expression of their journey by contemporary writers, we close the book with an anthology of Black writings on jazz that were published in various magazines and publications. And in the anthology, we start with what is a classic piece called Jazz and the White Critic, which was written by Leroy Jones, who later became known as Amiri Baraka, and contributed to Downbeat magazine in 1963. This particular piece that he wrote, Jazz and the White Critic, is very important to the core philosophy of this particular book. It points out the various disparities, as in, how is it, basically asking the question aloud, how is it that a music known as a contribution of Black Americans is so infrequently covered by Black Americans? So that's what that particular piece is about. We've also got contributions from other late great Black writers such as Mark Crawford, and we've got Bill Quinn, who wrote for Downbeat in the 1960s, and the late Stanley Crouch, who contributes a piece called Putting the White Man in Charge, and a piece by Eugene Hawley Jr., a piece by Ron Wynn, both of whom are contributors to the book, as is Anthony Dean Harris and Robin D.G. Kelly, and other contributions in the anthology section. And I should add, the anthology section, we're very pleased to have the contribution of several prominent musicians, writings by several prominent Black musicians in the anthology section, such as Dr. Billy Taylor, Wayne Shorter, Archie Shepp, Herbie Nichols, and Rex Stewart. We have pieces by all of them in the anthology section. And it's very important to add that we have a piece by a woman named Barbara Gardner in the anthology section. Barbara Gardner is very important because she, believe it or not, is the only African-American writer who rose to an editorial position at a major jazz publication. In her case, it was Downbeat magazine, and she became an associate editor of Downbeat magazine. And remember, I said earlier that there has never been a Black editor or publisher of any of the major jazz publications. Now, that may be about to change in the case of Jazz Times magazine, so stay tuned for news on the changing hands of Jazz Times magazine. But it still remains factual that no African American has risen to an editorial position at a major jazz publication other than Barbara Gardner. And we have a piece by Barbara Gardner in the anthology section. Very interesting woman, because she left, after she left the jazz writing craft, she went into advertising and was very successful in Chicago as an advertising agency executive. But those are the kinds of things that appear in this book, Ain't But a Few of Us. And just to give you a sense of some of the points that the writers in this book make in terms of how, and as I said earlier, these are writers expressing and detailing their journey to become music writers. And that's important to emphasize, because one of my goals with this book is to encourage other African Americans to write about jazz music and to write about music, period. Because for one thing, we know that we have one of the, perhaps arguably the richest, other than musicians, of course, but the richest sector of the so-called jazz community is probably jazz education. Jazz education is available across the globe. There are young people who still are interested in learning to play this music called jazz, whether that be to play the music professionally or to use that training as a touchstone for performing other musics, and for the music called jazz to inform those other music pursuits. So jazz education is a thriving sector of the so-called jazz community. But we know that despite the fact that there are these great numbers of young people who are interested in learning how to play this music, or who are interested in learning how to play music through the prism of jazz training, we know that only a tiny percentage of those musicians, those student musicians, are going to become professional musicians. So one of the goals of this book and of these kinds of conversations, one of my goals, is to try and encourage more young people to explore opportunities to write about music from a journalistic perspective. Because I know in my particular case, I've actually used my writing as a platform to explore other opportunities in this music. And I've been able to do that for a number of years now. For example, I've been able to develop my craft as a concert and festivals curator. And those kinds of opportunities ultimately stemmed from writing about the music and the doors that were opened for me as a result of writing about the music. And as I said, and I'll continue to emphasize, this book is not a book of grievances. It's not a book of aggrieved writers expressing their grievances in terms of how they develop their craft. It is a book with writers expressing their journey to become writers and to achieve bylines in magazines, publications, online, through books. And also we have a number of wonderful academics, people who have made high achievement in the academic world, stemming in part from their writing. People like Guthrie Ramsey, Farrah Jasmine Griffin, and others who have achieved. Robin D.G. Kelley, another example. Robin D.G. Kelley, for those of you who don't know him, is the man who wrote the superb biography of Thelonious Monk. Those particular writers are also contributors to this book, Ain't But a Few of Us. But just to give you a sense of some of the issues that some of these writers may have faced along the way, I'll tell you a little bit about Janine Coveney and her experience as a writer, and how race inevitably jumped into the picture in terms of her career arc. Janine was a writer for Billboard magazine, And she was a columnist for Billboard magazine. And she wrote about many forms of Black music, including jazz. And at one particular time, for a long time, her editor at Billboard magazine was a man named Timothy White. Timothy White is a white writer who wrote the definitive Bob Marley biography called Catch a Fire, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So Timothy White wrote the book Catch a Fire. Janine Coveney, on the other hand, has vast experience with a number of different Black musics, including the fact that she has deep familial roots in the Caribbean. So she has a lot of experience with Caribbean music and experiencing Caribbean music and interviewing and talking with Caribbean artists and that kind of thing. So unfortunately, during Timothy White's tenure, whenever Janine would request opportunities to write about Caribbean music, or would even include in her various columns notes about things happening in the Caribbean or what Caribbean artists are doing, whenever that would happen, Timothy White would scratch those references out of her columns and basically forbade her from writing about Caribbean music because he was the so-called authority on Caribbean music. And that's just an example of the kind of white supremacy or white agency that some of these writers have faced down through the years, where you have someone who is not as closely connected to the cultural perspective of the music, suggesting that he or she is the ultimate authority on the music, and that you who have roots in the music and have some experience with the music, you're not to write about this music because I'm the authority on this music. So that's just an example of some of the kinds of stumbling blocks that some of these writers faced. And again, the book is called Ain't But a Few of Us, Black Music Writers Tell Their Story. And to give you a sense of where we were initially coming from with this first series of articles and eventually this book, on the back cover, it reads as follows. Despite the fact that most of jazz major innovators and performers have been African American, the overwhelming majority of jazz journalists, critics, and authors have been and continue to be white men. No major mainstream jazz publication has ever had a Black editor or publisher. Ain't But a Few of Us presents over 24 candid dialogues with Black jazz critics and journalists ranging from Greg Tate, Farrah Jasmine Griffin, and Robin D.G. Kelly, to Tammy Kernodle, who wrote a definitive book on Mary Lou Williams, Ron Welburn, and John Murph. They discuss the obstacles to access for Black jazz journalists, outline how they contend with the world of jazz writing dominated by white men, and point out that these racial disparities are not confined to jazz, but hamper their efforts at writing about other music genres as well. Ain't But a Few of Us also includes an anthology section, which reprints classic essays and articles from Black writers and musicians such as Leroy Jones, Archie Shepp, A.B. Spellman, and Herbie Nichols. And so that gives you a sense of what this book, Ain't But a Few of Us, is about. Now, as far as who I am, well, I'm the artistic director of the DC Jazz Festival, an arts consultant, producer, educator, print and broadcast journalist. My writing has appeared in Jazz Times, Downbeat, Jazz Forum, Jazz Wise, and many other publications. And I'm also proud to say that I am the co-author of the As Told To autobiography of Randy Weston, NEA Jazz Master Randy Weston, the book titled African Rhythms, which came out in 2010, published by Duke University Press. I've also written a multi-part Billie Holiday documentary podcast series titled No Regrets that is going through the rights channel and music rights channel because of the enormous amount of music that we use. So that's coming. And I also have a bi-weekly jazz trivia game show called Jazzology, which is available on a platform called savagecontent.com. And that airs alternating Fridays at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we encourage all of you to be part of Jazzology and to become a jazzologist, shall we say. And when Gail and I were talking to set this conversation up, she suggested that I talk to you a little bit about DC Jazz Festival. DC Jazz Festival is coming up Labor Day weekend in September, and we'll have performances at various venues around DC, with our signature weekend being Saturday and Sunday of Labor Day weekend at the Wharf, which is on a lovely setting on the Potomac River in DC. And if you want more information about the DC Jazz Festival, that's dcjazzfest.org. We also have an annual competition called the DC Jazz Prix, and that's for young bands. And you can find out about that at dcjazzfest.org because the deadline is fast approaching. But in the meantime, please get your copy of Ain't But a Few of Us, Black Music Writers Tell Their Story. It's available at the Duke University Press website and available at Amazon.com and at your hippest bookstores. I'm Willard Jenkins, and thank you so much to Alternative Venues for Jazz, and thank you to my dear friend, Gail Boyd.